What's up, people? I just want to talk a little bit about some of the steps you might take when you're putting together a composition project, whether it's writing or some other creative endeavor. So we start at the moment when you realize you have to make something, which for some people is an exciting moment and for others is a moment of abject terror. Either way, it's okay because writing is a process. I'm not the only one who believes this. Hopefully this video will help you gain some insight into ways that creative projects can be effectively approached. Where do I begin? It's that big blank empty page. What am I supposed to do? How am I supposed to proceed? Well, it kind of depends on who you are and what your context is, and everybody may have different effective methods of approaching the task. Whoever you are, remember that your task is to complete the composition process in the end. Let's look at it as a process, with some branching options then to make it easier. First of all, you're going to receive a prompt. That happens in school all the time, and you probably know that. The prompt is the thing the instructor gives you that tells you what you're supposed to write about or research, the assignment details. In the world outside of the classroom, prompts exist in a variety of other forms. It could be that you're like, hey, I'd really like more money. In that case, you have to figure out the best way to get your boss or whoever makes those kinds of decisions to give you a raise. And you're going to have to write an email or prepare for a meeting. Maybe you're trying to get people to invest in your startup, and you have to put together a solid proposal. Or maybe you heard an interesting story on the radio and you suddenly realize that you should be advocating for a ban on pesticides that are killing bees. Prompts can come from just about anywhere. Whatever it is, it's creating a need to make a text, and you are going to be the author. So let's assume you've got a prompt, whether for the real world or a particular class. What's next? Maybe in some contexts, the text is going to need to be delivered so quickly that revisions and application of feedback are not feasible. But hammering out the text and sending it along without at least considering process options could be a problem. If you can, I recommend thinking about the process of composition. First of all, there is the brainstorm. I briefly mentioned this in another video. I'll give it a bit more space here, even though I'm sure you've heard about all kinds of ways to brainstorm. In this messy phase, you can bullet point out some thoughts. You can mind map, not unlike what I'm using for the backdrop of this video. Or even free write, where you basically engage your word processor and start banging out sentences or fragments to get to those elusive and charming and perhaps brilliant ideas and get them into some tangible form so that you can deal with them later. And these are just a small few of the methods for brainstorming that are out there. So, internet. Anyway, this isn't the final product of your process. To master composition, you have to see this as just one of the first steps. So we're going to get that brainstorm out, and then we're going to develop a plan. Generally speaking, you don't want to just move forward without any sense of direction. That might be different if you're exploring a character through free and direct discourse in a novel, but in academic and professional writing, you should have a clear plan. At this point, having developed a basic plan or working thesis, there are a couple of common ways to continue. Which works best for you depends on you, and you may find that in different composition scenarios, different approaches work better. One of these paths is that of the meticulous outliner. Now, a meticulous outliner is a person who finds that planning the organization of content in their text is essential before they begin the process of drafting the paragraphs. The other path is that of the constant reviser. Before putting too much effort into organization, they start drafting, alert as they go to necessary changes that need to be made in what's being composed so far. So let's take a moment to contrast that to the meticulous outliners, who are spending more of their time organizing their thoughts, maybe even going and collecting more information when it's relevant to their compositional context. This part of the process allows them to build schematics of sections of their composition with points and examples already arranged before they start actually drafting paragraphs. For the meticulous outliner, only after you've organized your thoughts and got everything or much of it in the right place, you start composing your drafts. On this path, chances are that you're going to spend most of your time organizing your thoughts and relatively little time on the laborious task of writing stylistically effective content. Compare that, then, to the other spectrum of approach. where the constant revisers are spending pretty much all their time drafting the work itself with only their working thesis and whatever attention they can give to evolutions along the way. Honestly, either approach can work. It just depends on what's best for you. No matter what path you take in the drafting of your composition, and assuming you keep at it until a draft of some sort is complete, you will likely find yourself with a flawed product. Do not despair. Process is in the nature of good work. So do you submit this thing you've created? No. Well, it depends. In some circumstances, limitations of time might require it, but generally you should not. You will want to look over it again. There are 3 terms that get tossed around sometimes as if they mean the same thing, but they are very different steps in the process. Revision, editing, and proofreading. You might do some of this as you draft, but just think about it as different ways of approaching drafted work that should be addressed individually and, arguably, in a certain order since they involve different amounts of work. I think it is helpful to consider them separately, which we'll do now. The first is revision. Revision. Looking at the composition as a whole and trying to determine whether its content and structure accurately reflect what you're trying to say. Content and structure are not little things. It's a big deal. They're at the heart of what the composition is about. When you revise your content, you may be considering big changes like new ideas or research that evolved along a process, and you may end up jettisoning entire sections you've written into oblivion because in the end they just don't work or don't fit. This is tough but necessary because you generally want to be as concise as possible, and the extra stuff that doesn't quite fit will probably just end up weakening your composition as a whole. Revision might also involve major structural changes, addressing either the grouping of ideas into unified paragraphs or the overall organization of your composition. You may find that you haven't really connected the dots on a particular point you're trying to make, and you have to compose new sections of a paragraph, or you may find that a paragraph you drafted relatively late in the process would actually work much better towards the beginning of your essay. Either way, these are pretty big changes. In the case of revision of either content or structure, the impact can be so great that it doesn't make sense to edit or proofread first, because as I just suggested, you may end up getting rid of that content altogether. That's why you want to address the larger issues first before you get to the more detailed work of editing and proofing. On to editing then, which is primarily concerned with style. As a literary term, the word style refers to the way that you express yourself in writing, through diction, syntax, or, respectively, word choice and word order. If you think about it, the words that you choose to use and the order you put them in pretty much characterize what the writing is like. Now, this differs from revision because you're not really focusing on what you're trying to say at this point, but how best to say it. You want to make sure that the words you're using accurately reflect what you're trying to say in the context for which you're writing. Is your word choice appropriate for your audience? Is it too informal, too formal, too obscure, too cliche? And your sentence structure, is it appropriately direct? Or are you composing sentences that wind around themselves with multiple clauses separated by commas? Depending on your writing context, long, complex sentences may be just fine, but your reader may prefer clarity. It may be that you just need to rearrange the sentence to cut out some of the unnecessary words and get more directly to your point. It could also mean the opposite. If your style is exceedingly terse, you may want to employ various transitional expressions to help your reader navigate your ideas. And whether we're talking about diction or syntax, it's all about what works best for the writing itself in a given context. Finally, we have proofreading. This is the most superficial of the 3 layers, and therefore is best done after revision and editing. In this stage, you are focusing on what may very well be pretty minor or even petty details, but as you may know, in many contexts of composition, the petty details can actually have great impact on your audience. You don't want your boss to get annoyed at the typos in the email you're sending, for example. Unless you do want to annoy your boss, but again, always analyze your specific rhetorical context when making these decisions. So these are just a few examples, but proofreading might involve checking for spelling or typographical errors, or just simply making sure that your formatting adheres to whatever formatting guidelines your context requires you to consider. This may be tedious, but it's often worthwhile to spend this time because it will only make your composition stronger. And going back to the importance of doing these 3 things, revision, editing, and proofreading, in order. Imagine taking the time to fix typos and format everything nicely only to end up completely deleting the paragraph because you decide that it doesn't work at all. That is a waste of time. Revise first, then edit, then proofread. So then you finished an iteration of this whole process, or at least one iteration, and you have to determine whether or not it's time to submit the composition to your audience. In the real world, it may very well be time. You won't always have the luxury of peer or instructor feedback on your composition, so getting good at guiding yourself through this process will help you here. No matter what the context, you will probably receive feedback. Now, depending on the context, however, you may have the chance to evaluate the feedback, make changes to your composition, and resubmit. This may be less common in the real world, but in composition classes and in many professional settings, it is quite possible that you will have the chance to apply further revisions or other minor changes, improving your work further. So then you have to ask yourself, do I take this opportunity, or do I just accept it and move on? Well, again, this is going to depend on your specific scenario, but it may be somewhat up to you to decide when the process of composition is over and you can finally move on with the rest of your life. This discussion, I'm sure, doesn't explain everything or present a foolproof one-size-fits-all strategy for approaching composition. But I do hope that it's helped to demystify the monumental task of composition a bit so that you can better approach whatever creative projects you have ahead of you.